evening. Thank you all for coming. Is anyone here for the first one?
Yeah!
Right, so I've really got to avoid asking the same question.
You asked my question earlier.
I might do the same intro. I think a different intro.
Possibly.
I might do a different intro this time.
Feel free.
Try and think of one. So, anyone who came to the first one, I said, my name is John Harris. I work for The Guardian. I used to work for the weekly music papers when they were around. And when I wrote for the NME, they sent me to do a big feature about Manic Street Creatures tied to the single From Despair to Where. And I went to a hotel in West London and I asked them what were probably quite boring and predictable questions. And out of nowhere, one and possibly two said something quite controversial. I'll just say that much, shall I? Yes.
Keep it clean, please.
Okay.
No. Details.
And I was amazed by the fact that I drew attention to this and roundly criticised this group for saying it. And I went to see them the following week, and they were all right with it, and they still liked me, and they thought it was quite interesting what I'd written, and we had a long conversation about it. And that, I suppose, in many ways, is one sign of what did make and does make Manic Street Creatures sort of unique, and why I've liked them for 30 years. So, I hope. Are you going to say something controversial tonight?
No, not even. Days are gone. I'm a fully rounded human being.
So before we start, can you please welcome the fully rounded human being, Nicky White?
Yeah!
So we're just going to talk mostly about the new album, The Ultra Vivid Lament, for sort of 10 or 15 minutes, and then we have some pre-submitted questions. These questions are the questions from the late shift, so to speak, which is you. So I can't promise that we will get through them all, but we'll ask a few. There's one about sketches. Trainers,
Which I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, definitely. That's when you might say something controversial.
I mean, I should say with our interview, it's very reflective of a time where we never had ill feeling towards journalists. And sometimes journalists said we were the greatest band of all time. Sometimes they said we were absolute shite. But it didn't matter to us at all. It was all part of, as Keith Richards would say, the price of an education. And we kind of loved every minute of it back then, of the good and the bad, that's all. And of course John did edit Select as well. He took it out of business.
That's not true.
I know.
I was not the last editor.
You set it on this course.
I said, here's the Titanic, you take over.
I know the feeling.
I'm sure you do. Right. I was going to ask you first of all about a song on Rewind the Film called Running Out of Fantasy.
Yes.
Which has the lyrics, has my fantasy run out of delusion, has my fantasy reached its logical conclusion? And you have said subsequently that that song sort of marked the end of something, perhaps, and the start of something else, in terms of, I think the way you put it was time to put the feather boa away. Just tell me about the transition from one to the other and where this particular record now sits in the midst of all that.
Yeah, that track in particular was a freeing of our souls, that maybe a Postcards from a Young Man was our kind of last great shot at a viable commercial entity. And it kind of worked on a lot of levels. I like the album. A lot of fans think it's quite cheesy, but I'm into it. And but we did think after that we can't keep up that kind of drill anymore, you know. And that's when we did Rewind the Film and Futurology concurrently at the same time, which was quite a hard thing to do because they were so opposite in their sounds. But Running Out of Fantasy just laid it bare really that for a sort of creative freedom, which we'd always had, but now which we perhaps embraced a bit more.
And I don't know whether you can be more specific, because I'm curious about, having been a band for as long as you have and made as many records as you have, things you now understand or think that you can't do, but also things that you can, which you couldn't do before.
Well, we can't get a single in the top four, for starters. And saw that coming, really, I guess. So I think we treated albums more as albums, like we'd done with the Holy Bible, perhaps. It gave a certain sense of artistic freedom to that we were less. We realised we were never going to get on Radio 1 anymore, or certain stuff like that, and we just sort of managed decline. Commercially, but artistically, we certainly just felt like we could do anything, really. And I think Futurology proved that we could master something that people wouldn't really associate with us.
So it's like a freeing moment as much as anything else.
It was.
Do you think also it's a moment when you can let more self-doubt and, saying you don't know, and there being somehow less certainty in the music, that's part of it as well?
Yes, I think, as a Cold War kid, I loved the certainty of politics, of good and evil, and around that time, everything became ravaged with doubt. Having kids, growing up, feeling your body sort of just wasn't where it used to be. The sagging of the brain, all those things combined. But I think we realised that it could be a really interesting sort of era if we really committed fully to it. Which I think certainly with Futurology, I think you can hear that.
Back then, I'm talking about when you first appeared, sort of early 90s, there were lots of things that you wrote and James sang, which I wouldn't have expected or imagined anyone else to sing. And that's still the case, but in a very different way. Remind me which song it is, because I've left my one sheet of lyrics in the dressing room, but remind me of the song on this record where you refer to sort of defending the middle ground.
It's in Complicated Illusions. And like I said, around that time, it was just the bombardment of my own research and what was sort of coming at me left me in a state of just paralysed contradiction, to be honest. So the middle ground I was thinking about, which is always slight, which is a middle ground that runs through Naira Bevan and Clement Attlee, and right through to, say, John Prescott, Margaret Beckett. That is my kind of middle ground, which just felt, it's almost doesn't exist anymore, I guess. So, but it was also a middle ground in my head, because that certainty. I would love to be as certain as I was when I was 20, and as cocksure of everything I said being an absolute work of genius. But your kind of ego is, certainly in family life, your ego is just totally destroyed.
Yeah.
It is. Yeah. If you're as useless as me as a lot of things, like can't cook, couldn't drive, can't put the baby seat in the back of the fucking car.
You're anti-dishwasher, aren't you?
Oh.
So you don't have the argument though about the correct way to load the dishwasher?
No, I just watch it. That's one thing, as you know, I am good at, is cleaning, housework. I'd rather clean out a public toilet than make a fucking sandwich.
There is a labour shortage at the moment, so you may. There are quite bleak moments on this record lyrically, which is not a new thing.
No.
You've made me feel quite bleak on several times. But when you sing "Every battle I've ever fought has either been lost or bought," that's a hell of a thing. Do you really feel like that?
At that point, I did. That whole song is just. It's like a collapse of your own ideology.
This is which song, Defiant?
That's Complicated Illusions.
Complicated Illusions. Okay.
And it's just like a collapse of belief. This is obviously certain belief systems that you keep with you, but I guess there's a lack of relevance. Starting to feel on the cusp of irrelevance as a human being, not as someone in a band necessarily, but just as a person. Slightly dramatic, I know, when I'm sat at home watching The Sopranos for the 10th time, but that's I think giving up drinking. I haven't had a drink for over about 11 years now, so that the kind of solace, the romance of that is just the kind of bleak, harsh truth. I prefer the mirror to the screen.
It's good. And there's that, I suppose, as a sort of defiant, confrontational quality of itself, right? Because it's bracing honesty then, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think when we started, the kind of strangeness about us was the idea that we wanted to be huge and mainstream. You know, as you know, we were entering a world of kind of indie elitism. You know, and the fact that we said we like The Clash and Bruce Springsteen and Guns N' Roses was actually quite shocking to people who had just been brought up on Swerve Driver or something. You know, it was hard to get across to people that, you know, the Butthole Surfers weren't our favourite band.
Oh, and that was Defiant.
Definitely. You know.
And do you think there's...
I remember when you wrote about us and you mentioned Rocket Queen by Guns N' Roses, we were doing I-5s, like, someone's fucking got it.
I didn't actually. It was my friend Carlo I took with me to see you, who had hair like Slash. And he knew.
I remember him.
Yeah. He's dined out for 30 years on the fact that you said he was a cool fucker. But he said that bit's from Rocket Queen, and I don't think you'd had anyone associated with the weekly music papers in your dressing room who would recognise that.
Never. And even the Clash back then, the Clash were not. They weren't a popular band in the music press at that point. You know, you just never heard a mention of them.
In those days, and forgive me, I'm an old fart now, but telling war stories, during the Battle of the Somme, when you put a record out or said something or played a gig, there was this thing that every week would come out full of commentary about groups and artists of all kinds, but you were part of that, right? And it's almost like you tailored yourselves to make that relationship work, right? You were a band that really shone in the weekly music papers and enjoyed being in it and so on. And almost like that was like the anvil you'd harden things up on, right? And that's not there anymore. Right? Do you miss it? Even as somehow some weird part of the creative process, the fact that it was there.
I certainly miss it as a fan, if you know what I mean, as a consumer of culture, shall we say. I mean, it actually takes a lot for me to come across as a nice person, you know. It does take a lot of inward control to be kind of to make a good impression of myself. As Virginia Woolf said, you know, to enjoy freedom, we have to control ourselves, and I think I need to control myself to enjoy any kind of freedom anymore. But back then, we just took our bedrooms into the music press, you know.
That's good.
And it was, for better or for worse, sometimes obviously it didn't come across particularly well, but other times it just felt like you were a centre of a culture that you'd grown up with, and that culture's not there anymore. I feel sorry for other bands because, you know, you just end up having, you know, either people saying how amazing you are, or just someone calling you a cunt on Twitter.
But I wonder as well whether you were almost like doing Twitter 30 years before Twitter was invented. Because if you say it wasn't you who said it, but if one of the group says we will always hate Slowdive more than Adolf
Richie,
right?
That's Richie.
That's like a tweet, isn't it?
I think Richie was far ahead of me in that acceleration of culture, of the soundbite, shall we say?
Yeah, right.
And he could back it up with a much greater intellect than me, and he loved the challenge of talk, of learning, of history, of everything, really. And there's plenty of times where I was just, you know, trying to catch his coattails. In all honesty, I was more interested in my hair and the blouse that I was going to wear. But we worked well as a team, and I think around there's obviously around This Is My Truth. I think I came across desire just to see slightly more wise, maybe, you know, just lyrically especially, that I realised straight away I couldn't write lyrics like Richie or do interviews like Richie. That's for sure. That I certainly took on a different persona.
Yeah. There are lyrical echoes of This Is My Truth actually in parts of this record. I had like shades of My Little Empire. I thought was sort of relevant as a name to drop. The Everlasting, maybe.
Lyrically, definitely The Everlasting. I think in Still Snowing in Sapporo.
That was the last question I was going to ask you about before these questions.
Yeah.
Tell me about Snowing in Sapporo now. I wonder whether that's an example of sort of like emotional recall, because it's almost like you wrote it feeling exactly as you felt at that point. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and during lockdown, I'm sort of archivist of the band, and I found all this footage from Sapporo of the four of us playing arcade games and landing into Sapporo, which is not a place many people go, even when they tour Japan. And it was snowing, and it was quite dangerous, and we did have leopard print coats on, and I was holding hands with Richie because I was slightly frightened. I wasn't a brilliant flyer at that point, and I could read the video footage. Just really brought it all back. It was the only place I was a really bad traveller and a bad eater. James, Sean, Richie loved all the Japanese food, and I was living on McDonald's apple pie or some shit like that. But in
Must have got burned a lot in my experience.
And when we got to Sapporo, it's the only place in Japan that grows potatoes. So there was a baked potato store. I literally wandered around for 4 days eating baked potatoes.
Why isn't that in the lyrics? For God's sake, why isn't that that's the last verse? Because you couldn't find a rhyme for potato.
It's not many. That emotional recall is just so vivid, which fitted in with a vivid lament. And it's probably the only song that grapples with an essence of the four of us, shall we say, in the band that we were. And I just thought if someone's going to recall history, it'd be, I'm probably the best person to do it because I've got such a vivid memory. I think it's one of our best opening tracks to an album, to be honest.
I'm thinking thoughts not far from that as I listen to it on the way down.
Yeah, we got a real tingle when we play it live.
I am now going to move to some of the questions we've had sent in. Is there anyone here whose name fits Nigel WM? I don't know if that's West Midlands or... No, not here. It's a good question though. Oh, he is here. Nigel WM, are you here? Brilliant. Right, here's your question. You've been asked this before, but I want to know. Apart from your hometown gig, I've never seen you play an encore. Just wondered why. Do you think the whole going and off thing is all on and off thing is all a bit of a charade?
Yeah. We did explain this earlier that one time we did it at the Marquee, we left it so long that everyone had gone. But it's terrible. But in our kind of 5-year plan, one of the which included never write a love song and never do an encore, split up after one album. So we kept. That was one of the major kind of blocks of that was never do an encore. I think we might have done maybe 1 or 2 through some sort of coercion for TV, but that's it.
You do an encore at Cuba?
We were just fucking ordered to then.
Otherwise you ain't going out. Bob Carridan, are you here?
Yeah.
Right, are you down the front?
Right side.
That's Keen. Mustard Keen, right. 2 questions from Bob Carridan. I'm only going to pick one, Bob, forgive me, right? So you may disagree with my selection. Which one do you want, the new and old material question, or what's Nick going to do with the solo album question?
That one.
Ooh,
Right.
yeah.
The solo album question. Bob asks, when can we expect the release date for Nick's I don't know what to fucking do with this album? Is that the movie title?
Sort of.
Like Ron Wood's I've got my own album to do.
It just needs mixing, and it's just whether I can be bothered.
Next year.
No, it's a step up from I Killed the Zeitgeist, which isn't hard. But it's all ready to go, and it's kind of got a nice point of interest to it. And it's nice Nicky Wyatt,
I never thought of you as anything else, I have to say. In fact, in those early interviews, it was always commented on how polite you were as you record everybody else.
Yeah, politeness costs nothing.
Christina, is anyone called Christina here? There may be several people called Christina here. Christina asks, what's your writing routine? Do you have a daily word count you try and meet? You try working for the Guardian. or simply wait for the inspiration? Good question.
It is really, for me, it's really erratic, and it does depend on just certain ticks of inspiration and travel, weather, books. everything. It's just completely erratic. It has no rhyme or reason. It has no real form. It usually starts with a title. I am obsessed with stationery, so like certain stationery I definitely write better lyrics on.
Do you, is it like, right, there is an album coming, so I will now go to wherever I have to go between, say, 10 and 3, and I will try and write lyrics?
No, it's just not. It's just, You Stole the Sun, for instance, I wrote on a plane going to Australia thinking I was going to die. And people use it as a fucking wedding song. They do. Southern Welsh Heart, which is one of my favourite lyrics. I mean, this is not very eco-friendly at all, but I only sort of ended up finishing it because we flew to South Korea to do it. We weren't doing a gig, but I knew I was going to finish it in a nice hotel in South Korea.
How could you possibly get married to a song called You Stole the Sun, whose first lines are drinking what water to stay thin? Isn't that
classic first dance material? I've written a lot of songs in hotels, and I've got a huge collection of hotel stationery, which you don't get anymore, which is a real sad demise.
It's rubbish. You don't even get biros.
No. And I've got a large collection of pens and flannels. So I used to carry a wet flannel around with me. I was probably one of the first persons to have a man bag with anti-back wipes and a flannel.
You carried around a permanently wet flannel?
I did. It's like a comfort blanket.
Doesn't it start to smell? Damn.
Bottle wash it.
These are amazing lifestyle tips you're here on this evening, ladies and gentlemen. Right, last question. We've got to wrap up in a minute. Mark Wilkin Jones, are you here? That may be a Welsh Jones. It's a good question on which to finish. And again, this may be a familiar line of inquiry, but I think it's still worth asking. What would the 21-year-old boys who planned to sell 16 million copies of the debut album split up think of 52-year-old men being album of the day on Radio 2?
I think James and Sean would be pretty fucking pleased. I mean, Richie would have said, that plan has failed.
That's good. The plan hasn't really failed, which is why we're here. Thank you so much for coming. This is not the end. Obviously, James is going to come on and play now. But for now, will you please join me in thanking Nicky?